can you reach enlightenment through etiquette? Now, this sounds like kind of a ridiculous question, right? Can you reach enlightenment? Can you reach wisdom through etiquette? And we're talking about, which spoon is the soup spoon, and should I eat from the outside in or the inside out, or does the knife go on the outside? I honestly have no idea. So obviously I haven't reached any kind of wisdom through etiquette, which is probably fairly characteristic in philosophy. But nevertheless, this is actually characteristic, I think, of the West in general and our perspective towards etiquette and rules of ceremony, rite, and ritual, especially those that are of just simple social importance. We tend to look at these things as being arbitrary and random, and as such, having no value in and of themselves. In other words, if a rite or ritual only has value insofar as other people like to see you doing it, then we tend to think of that as, well, just another cultural thing. When in Rome, live as the Romans do, maybe, but aside from that, that's just a bunch of, garbage. And that tends to be our perspective on this sort of thing. And unless the rite or ritual has itself some meaning that can be gotten at beyond just the act of doing whatever it is, then we don't tend to like that kind of thing very much. So we don't like empty ceremony. We don't like empty rites and rituals, such as the soup spoon and whatnot. Although there might be some order in that, right? Some sense, and I don't know, maybe knowing which utensil I'm guessing here, right? Nevertheless, this is meant in all seriousness, I think. And for Confucius, this idea in particular is made plain. If we look in chapter 3 of the Intellects, Zekung wished to do away with the offering of the sheep connected with the inauguration of the first day of each month. And the master said, "Say you love the sheep, I love the ceremony." And so this, and Confucius not sitting on his mat, for instance, unless it was perfectly aligned. It's these little details that one looks at, especially from a Western perspective, and questions, what could possibly be the value of that kind of thing? And especially in making it a central part of philosophy, what could possibly be the value in emphasizing that people simply participate in the ritual harmoniously and with homogeny? Is that really valuable? And so our cultural values in some way set us up for not being able to understand this very easily, not being able to understand the impact of Confucianism very easily. One of the suggestions that I want to throw out there is the overall difference between the West and the East with respect to the group and the individual. This is something that deserves to be said with respect to Chinese philosophy in general, and hopefully this will help a little bit with Confucianism. You can see this even in the language, that the individual in the Far East is de-emphasized, and the group is really more important than the individual. And while we may think in a utilitarian sort of way that the good of the many outweighs the good of the individual, we don't tend to think that we don't tend to think of ourselves as part of the group first and then as an individual second. We think of ourselves as an individual first and then as an individual who identifies with a number of groups, rather than the other way around. And that's really an important distinction. So for Confucius and for the others, this was certainly a part of the culture to which they would have been familiar. And then this kind of approach then may be a little bit more sensible in light of that de-emphasizing of the individual and his or her importance. One of the reasonable explanations that I've heard for this is that in the East, the staple crop is, in the Far East in China, the staple crop is rice. And rice and rice paddies require a bit more group coordination to succeed with than does growing something like corn or the maize or wheat or what have you. It's possible for a farmer to take his family, as it was, for instance, with the American frontier in the 19th century, to take his family out west, simply having a few animals and seeds or whatever he needed, secure a few acres, and have a self-sustaining little miniature society of his own without necessarily depending upon someone else for food. And in the East, with the rice paddies, this is really not as feasible. And so it's natural then that the group should be emphasized, because the group is necessary for the sustainment even of the individual. And so the constellation into these groups would have been something of a necessity simply because of the way that agriculture functioned. That's one suggestion. Suffice to say that this is the reality that we encounter in the East, and especially in ancient China, that the individual is less than the group, and the identification with the group comes first. Now, with Confucius in particular, we're talking about someone who lived around 500 BC, 551 to 479. This is, again, the axial age, around the same time as the Buddha and Heraclitus and Lao Tzu. And this is curious in particular, I think, with the rise of Confucius, because his philosophy and approach is decidedly different in many ways than the mystical approaches of the others that I just mentioned. With Taoism in particular, since this arose in the same country, it's interesting to see the contrast in emphasis between Confucianism, which is very clearly a more practically focused approach, and Taoism, which is decidedly mystical and individual, emphasizing individual experience and understanding, a sort of Enlightenment experience. Whenever you hear about Enlightenment and mysticism, you're talking about an individual effort, not a group effort. Confucius's name, this is also, I think, interesting, since we all hear about Confucius, but the name Confucius is really just a Latinized, if you will, version of Confucius, which simply means Master Kung. And Kung is the name of, it's a family name. So he was the master of the Kung family. So something of a title. Confucius, his general approach was to emphasize politics and governance over individual accomplishment and understanding. And the idea that politics is a higher art than ethics for the individual is something that we get from Aristotle as well. So this is not an unfamiliar idea even in the West, that once we figure out how to get virtue on an individual level, okay, let's take this then to a societal level. And this is Aristotle's argument in the Nicomachean Ethics. With Confucius, I think we see something of the same kind of emphasis being placed on politics and governance and what it's like to create a good society, with the idea being that if you have a good society, if you have a good governor or a good ruler, then the society will naturally tend to create better people. And when I say better people, I mean in terms of virtue, goodness, not just more successful people, but actually good on a personal and from a psychological health perspective. That's something that we really don't emphasize very much in our culture in particular, because we tend to think that the nature of virtue and what makes a good person is something that should be decided by a maybe even an individual level, but a church perhaps, or whoever you get that set of values from. And we're of a mind to say that the government should keep out of that, for better or worse. And there are certainly implications for both. As I mentioned, I believe with Buddhism, there was a Buddhist teacher that made the comment in looking at the Western educational system and saying that we do a lot for the mind in terms of knowledge and training, technical training, but we don't seem to address the issues of psychological health and whether or not we're generating good people. That doesn't seem to be addressed in any formal way, which is a curious and decidedly different perspective than what we get, for instance, with Aristotle, and then especially, of course, with Confucius. So Confucius is concerned with practical wisdom, is concerned with practical utility, and especially for how do you govern people. Because of this, Confucius himself sought political office, and although he got a little ways, he did not get as far as he wanted, and made some rather brash claims about what period one could expect to have him ruling or his ideas implemented before success would be expected in that society. He expected that within the span of only a few years, for instance, that the society could be perfected. He says in chapter 13, the master said, if there were only if there were any of the princes who would employ me in the course of 12 months, I should have done something considerable. In 3 years, the government would be perfected. Well, that's a pretty strong claim. I mean, 3 years, can you imagine a presidential candidate making that brash of a claim? I think we would be disinclined to believe him. So, nevertheless, Confucius obviously thought very highly of what his political philosophy was capable of doing. Now, that Confucius did not succeed practically in terms of his own political aspirations. is interesting. And if we take a look at his last words, we also get another hint of something interesting and perhaps a failure. He says, or is reported to have said, the mountain is crumbling down, the pillar is falling down, the sage is passing out. This is a strange thing, I should think, for someone in this position and someone of this fame and esteem to have said, reportedly as their final words. It does seem to indicate failure. This is as curious, I would think, or curious in the same sort of way as the last words of Christ. For instance, if you've taken a look at this, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? That does seem out of keeping, or at least it's easy to interpret it in a way that is out of keeping with the gist of the way that people typically understand the remainder of his work. And with Confucius, it's the same sort of thing. Though it's not directly negative, it does make us wonder. It's not perhaps what you might expect from someone like Confucius. All right. If I haven't mentioned this already, the Analects of Confucius are arguably second only to the Christian Bible in influence. And I mean this by the number of people that use it, the societies that have been influenced by it, and have incorporated some of its values, either explicitly or simply into their culture. So when we consider Confucius's emphasis on propriety and the remainder of his work, I think we should suspend doubt that it is, something that should be completely dismissed very easily, because it has been so influential. Now, that's not to say that it's necessarily right, but when you have billions of people doing something, it's probably at least going to be interesting. All right. Now, Chung Yung is an idea that we should mention. The golden mean, harmony and equilibrium. Confucius's concept here is very similar to the essentially a virtuous person, a balanced and harmonious individual with respect to their approach. So this is someone who can maintain an equilibrium, someone who can maintain their virtue at any time. And this would be accomplished presumably by the superior man, the Chun Tzu. I would say this is roughly comparable to some of the topics that we've already covered, particularly with the serenity, for instance, of the Stoics, the self-sustaining eudaimonia that Aristotle referred to, the mindfulness and enlightened state of Buddhism, or I should say perhaps at least the refined samadhi of someone who is very skilled and able to keep that mindfulness and peace regardless of exterior circumstances. And I think this is the kind of thing that is meant here, that this is someone who is good, and not just good when it is convenient, but good and balanced at any time. Jin is another concept that we should address. This would be general human virtue, being good to other people. How do you become a good person? How do you become a virtuous person? And this is something that, curiously, Confucius is said not to have taught directly. So we have something that harkens back to Socrates and the Meno, that virtue is something that is not necessarily capable of being taught directly, and presumably is ineffable and perhaps beyond words. So that somehow with a push, a motivation, striving for perfection, that someone could eventually attain to this perfection in terms of their action and their thinking. So it's curious that, again, we have this proper analog, I think, between Platonic philosophy even and Confucianism, and really most any other religious system. While you do get some explicit prescriptions with respect to morality and whatnot, in general, how to become a good person and how to change oneself, especially if the emphasis is on changing one's thoughts and changing one's desires that arise. That tends to be not spoken of much, and regarded as ineffable, something that you simply have to understand intuitively or come to on your own somehow, and is not teachable. So there is a curious continuity with respect to those concepts as we proceed through philosophical and religious history. All right. Now, if you take a look at the intellects that you have, I want to go through these by category and suggest that there are some themes that are prominent in the intellects. So let's begin with propriety. So if we're talking about the adherence to ceremony and ritual, so we're talking about Li. Filial piety and fraternal submission, are they not the root of all benevolent actions? We get this in chapter 1. And when respect is shown according to what is proper, one keeps far from shame and disgrace. Now, filial piety, in other words, piety towards one's brothers in whatever sense that might mean, one's family. This indicates a simple submission to the values of the society, love of one's family, regardless of what they do, and submission to the powers that be, again, regardless of what they do. Is this not the root of all benevolent actions? Now, that is a curious claim to make. We don't normally think about the root of virtue and the root of being good to other people as being connected with what are apparently arbitrarily decided values and power structure. So ceremony and ritual and whatnot. But this is precisely what Confucius suggests. So again, I would suggest to you, give this some thought. What does adherence to a ritual actually do for you? For instance, one of the analogs I think that is interesting with this is in Catholic Mass. If you've ever attended a Catholic Mass that's given entirely in Latin, and you don't speak it, presumably, and it is not translated for you, then what do you get out of it? So you don't necessarily understand the words, but you stand up and kneel with everyone else, and you go through and perhaps take communion and do the other things in the rituals. What do you get out of that if you don't understand what the other people are saying? Is there anything that you can get out of it? And I think certainly there is. But what is it? It's not going to be something that is on an intellectual basis only, surely, because the emphasis then is on the experience and perhaps on the sound and the sights. The cathedral in particular, the cathedrals as we see them used in Catholicism, these are impressive structures, and they are meant, as one person has suggested at least, I think a decent interpretation of the gist of the cathedral is to make the individual feel small and to give you some idea of the greatness and the scope of the kind of thing that you're dealing with. And so even the echo of the priest's voice and the projection therein and what this sounds like among all the stained glass and stone, that tends to be somewhat more impressive, I think, than if you'd simply turned on the TV inside a small room. So we're led to ask, I think, a very reasonable question: what does this do for the individual psychologically? Obviously, we're not talking about a purely intellectual experience here, and I don't think the claim, even in Christianity, is that is necessarily the case. So, and this is not to diminish the experience in the slightest, but to hopefully supply some reason for thinking that, maybe Confucius is not entirely off in the weeds with this. We do tend to get something out of the experience of a ritual, I think, simply by going through the ritual with other people and by taking the ritual seriously, even if we don't know exactly what its intention really is or understand intellectually what's going on. Simply by participating in it and doing what other people do. And for instance, being involved in something larger than oneself, essentially, something that the crowd is doing. There is a distinct feeling associated with that, and this is something that's been studied in psychology extensively, so I would refer you to that discipline for more on this. But for instance, even a popular analog, I think, in our contemporary culture is that of a sporting event, like a football game, cheering with tens of thousands of other people and doing specific cheers, for instance, with tens of thousands of other people. It's fun. And there's something good about the experience of doing whatever it is with a lot of other people. And that sort of approach, I think, may give us hints at what Confucius had in mind with at least something that brings the society together. Now, whether this is the root of all benevolent actions, can you go that far with it? I don't know. But at the very least, to suggest that there is something of value there is necessary, I think, for someone in our society, because we're really not familiar with that sort of thing being all that valuable. And people frequently make fun of that kind of behavior. But nevertheless, we see it in every society. So anyway, much to be made of that. If you're interested in it, you can certainly look it up and find a wealth of studies that have been done in the field of psychology. All right. In chapter 2, same thing. Filial piety is not being disobedient. This is the same emphasis on simply doing what is required of you, regardless of what the rules might be. So there's no sense of do what is required of you, but only if you think it's right. There's none of that. It's simply do what is required of you. And we're, I think in the West, very resistant to that kind of thinking. So this is a great exercise for us to try to understand the works of Confucius and the works of Eastern philosophy on their own terms and see if there is something valuable here, because it does call into question some of our core values of individualism. All right. Now, with respect to the engendering of virtue and the becoming of a good person, the gaining of Jin. In chapter 12, Yinwan asks about perfect virtue, and the Master said, to subdue oneself and return to propriety is perfect virtue. Again, completely annihilating self-importance and returning to propriety. Yinwan said, I beg to ask the steps of that process. In other words, how do you do it? How do you become a good person? And the Master replied, look not at what is contrary to propriety, listen not to what is contrary to propriety, speak not what is contrary to propriety, and make no movement which is contrary to propriety. So don't do anything, regardless of what it is, that is contrary to what is proper. Now, this sort of unthinking approach is very alien, I think, to a lot of Western philosophies. So at the very least, I suggest this as an interesting exercise in trying to consider an idea that is truly different than what we're accustomed to. All right. Now, humility is another major heading for Confucius. And again, humility is a major heading for every major religion and philosophy, with, I would think, few to no exceptions, none that I'm aware of. In chapter 1, the Master said, I will not be afflicted at men's not knowing me. I will be afflicted that I do not know men. So not being concerned with posterity. I have not yet seen one who could perceive his own faults and inwardly accuse himself. This being much harder, of course, than placing blame on others and finding fault with others. We're all experts at that, right? All right. In chapter 9, there were 4 things from which the Master was entirely free. He had no foregone conclusions, no arbitrary predeterminations, no obstinacy, and no egoism. So not jumping to conclusions about other people, no prejudices, in other words, no arbitrary predeterminations, no arbitrary prejudices, no arbitrary judgments about things. He was not resistant, and he was not arrogant. In saying of someone else, he dislikes none, he covets nothing, what can he do but what is good? Another interesting thought. Again, there seems to be the emphasis on selfless action, and the more that one can annihilate self-concern, the more that we tend to behave in a way which is good. And remember, this is not just a way which is good for others, but a way which is ultimately good for ourselves as well. That's not just Confucianism, of course. This point was made in a previous lecture. This is an interesting quote, I think, in chapter 12. The Master said, the superior man has neither anxiety nor fear. When internal examination discovers nothing wrong, what is there to be anxious about? What is there to fear? So if you look inwardly and you've done everything that you can to be as good as you can, then why would you be anxious about something, and why would you fear something? You've done absolutely everything that you can. And that, I think, is an interesting statement, because most of the time when we come into a new situation or we have something go wrong, we're frequent to say, oh, well, I could have done that better. I could have, thought of this other person more. I could have been more considerate or, kinder or gentler or what have you. But of course, for the superior man, again, for the Chunsu, if this is someone who has no anxiety or fear, perhaps it is because He's doing everything that he can internally and finds no flaw. Again, this is another major point of continuity between Confucianism and other religions and philosophies. In chapter 15, the Master said, what the superior man seeks is in himself. What the mean man seeks is in others. In other words, what the average man seeks is in others. So if you're an uneducated person from this perspective, then you're going to look for things in other people, and you're going to look for extrinsic things. You're going to look for that which is outside of yourself. The superior man, however, seeks what is in himself. So this is very much a Stoic approach, right? That the real solution to the problem is not the correction of other people, but the correction of oneself. This is particularly curious in Confucianism, since the emphasis is on politics and on governance. And nevertheless, Confucius still speaks of perfection of oneself. We get this in Buddhism to some degree with the mantra, "May all sentient beings be happy." Generally, though, the way to make all sentient beings be happy is to perfect oneself, frequently in isolation. And so when people first see this, they say, well, how are you making other people happy by not even having contact with them? And the idea, I think, is that you are allowing yourself to have the most positive impact conceivable by perfecting yourself, becoming as good of a person as you can. And a good person necessarily has a positive impact on others to the maximal degree, much more so than giving them money or anything material. All right. Now, ceremony and adherence to that, we'd already mentioned with respect to propriety, the ineffable and the unity, perhaps the all is one sort of concept. So maybe we're not entirely divorced from Taoism here. In chapter 4, the Master said, "Shan, my doctrine is that of an all-pervading unity." The Master went out and the other disciples asked, saying, "What do his words mean?" Saying said, "The doctrine of our Master is to be true to principles of our nature and the benevolent exercise of them to others. This and nothing more." In other words, that's it. Be a good person, be true to the principles, be true to propriety, and exercise this consistently and well. And there you have it. Eminently practical. But this is apparently leading towards an all-pervading unity. Now, this is not discussed in a philosophical capacity, so whether this is really the same or even analogous to the mystical claim that all is one, I don't know. But nevertheless, that it's mentioned in this way and spoken of as being a real harmony across people is interesting in and of itself. All right, continuing with the topic of the ineffable, Zekung in chapter 5 said, "The Master's personal displays of his principles and ordinary descriptions of them may be heard. His discourses about man's nature and the way of heaven cannot be heard." So in other words, when he's talking about man's nature, when he's talking about assumably perfection of virtue and the way of heaven. Remember, the way of heaven, we're very likely talking about the Tao of Tian. So in heaven and nature, they are similar in the translation of that word. So again, the discourses about the most important things, presumably, are ineffable. The Master said, chapter 17, "I would prefer not speaking." Zekung said, "If you, Master, do not speak, then what shall we as your disciples have to record?" And the Master said, "Does heaven speak? The 4 seasons pursue their courses, and all things are continually being produced. But does heaven say anything?" In other words, what's the value of speech? What does speaking really do? And this may point us toward an emphasis on experience and observation. Just look. Just see what's going on. Don't try to analytically understand the world necessarily, but experience it and see what it is on its own terms. And if you can really see that clearly, then perhaps you're already there. And we get that in a lot of mystical traditions, and this seems to be the same sort of thing that's being discussed here. All right. Now, as far as how to get to perfect virtue, perfect virtue is another one of the major headings that I want to emphasize here, along with the ineffable and humility and propriety. In chapter 5, the Master said of Tse Chen, "Of superior virtue indeed is such a man. If there were not virtuous men in Lu, Lu is a place, how could this man have acquired this character? In other words, can you be a good person if there are not other good people around you?" And this is an interesting question. How much do we actually get from other people in terms of virtue? How much can we learn from other good people in terms of virtue? In the Dhammapada, we hear about this in terms of, does the spoon taste the soup? No, the tongue tastes the soup, obviously. A man can be around someone of great learning for a long period of time and never really get much out of it. But if you're awake even for a moment, it's said, in the presence of a master, that's enough. Now, the fact that it is necessary, or at least that the master is involved in that somewhat, is interesting, such that you can get something from contact with someone like this, that there is a benefit to being around someone who has great virtue if you are awake to it, if you are present to it, and you're not entirely closed. So we have a similar discussion, I think, here in Confucianism, or at least a similar way of addressing that topic. All right. Perfect is the virtue according to the which is according to the golden mean in chapter 6. We get an interesting comment in chapter 9 where he says, "The wise are free from perplexities, the virtuous from anxiety, and the bold from fear." Well, obviously the bold are going to be free from fear. That's the kind of the nature of our understanding of that concept. That the virtuous are free from anxiety is a curious thing. This points back, I think, to the statement that I mentioned in chapter 12, where the Chungyung, Chunsu, superior man has neither anxiety nor fear, because internal examination has discovered nothing wrong, so there's nothing to be anxious about. All right. In chapter 12, we read, "The Master said, 'The man of perfect virtue is cautious and slow in his speech.'" Cautious and slow in his speech, said Mu. Is this what is meant by perfect virtue? The Master said, "When a man feels the difficulty of doing, can he be other than cautious and slow in speaking?" There's another statement in the Analects which is kind of amusing. It's said that one of the disciples reported that someone was thinking 3 times before speaking, and Confucius responded and said, "Thinking twice is enough." So think before speaking, thinking twice instead of thinking 3 times is kind of overkill, apparently. All right. Again, to think carefully and to be cautious and slow in one's speech, realizing the import and the consequences of it. All right. Now, when we were speaking of the golden mean, especially as relates to being a good person and what we are very familiar with, the golden rule, we have almost an explicit statement of this in chapter 15. Zekung asked, "Is there one word which may serve as a rule of practice for all one's life?" And the Master said, "Is not reciprocity such a word? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others." Well, that's very much our concept, isn't it? I mean, we're familiar with this, so this should not be all that contentious, I would think. There are a few other statements that I want to mention just to wrap up with Confucianism in the Analects that are worth mentioning and worth speaking about, I believe. In chapter 15, we read that the Master said, "I've been the whole day without eating, and the whole night without sleeping, occupied with thinking. It was of no use. A better plan is to learn." Learning and acquisition of knowledge is something that is emphasized in Confucianism. The thought being that learning is more valuable than the process simply of rumination, and that there is a value in the acquisition of knowledge. Now, whether this is for the purposes of propriety, betterment of society, this is not made as explicit, but that this is emphasized provides us with something of a contrast to Taoism and what would become Zen. All right. Confucius in chapter 7 says, There is nothing which I do that is not shown to you, my disciples. That is my way. In other words, there is no hidden learning. There is no secret knowledge. And that makes this an eminently practical tradition, and something that is not seen as dangerous, or you do not have to have the revealed wisdom in the same way as you get with some other traditions. Speaking particularly of some of Confucius's eccentricities with respect to propriety, we read in chapter 10, he did not eat rice which had been injured by heat or damp or turned sour, nor fish or flesh which was gone. In other words, anything that was bad. He did not eat what was discolored, but was of bad flavor, nor of anything which was ill cooked or not in season. If his mat was not straight, he did not sit on it. Now that his being picky with food is something exceptional among the traditions, especially that flourished in that area. The Buddhist monks, for instance, now it's popularly thought that vegetarianism is a requirement, and this is not the case universally. Frequently, the monks, especially in areas where that were impoverished, the monks were allowed to eat meat, but if it only insofar as it was not killed for them. So but they were certainly not as picky as to the flavor of the food, or if something was discolored. Probably didn't want to eat something if it had gone bad, of course. But they were certainly not as concerned with what was right and proper with respect to the quality of the food. So this is kind of an interesting thing to note with Confucius, and almost makes him look like an Epicurean rather than some of the philosophers that we're more familiar with in the region. All right. As a final note, the tripartite division of people that we encounter in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics with his reference to the old poets in saying that you have the best kind of people, you have the second best people that can learn, and then you have the third and they're useless. Confucius gives us a very similar breakdown in chapter 16, saying that those who are born with the possession of knowledge are the highest class of men. Those who learn and so readily get possession of knowledge are the next. Those who are dull and stupid and yet compass the learning are another next to these. As to those who are dull and stupid and yet do not learn, they are the lowest of people. So we have a very similar stratification, you might say, with respect to the different kinds of people that you can encounter. It's interesting to see that this carries over to Confucianism as well as to most of the other philosophies that we encounter. He said in chapter 17, there are only the wise of the highest class and the stupid of the lowest class who cannot be changed. So the mutable, those that are capable of change and learning, are the ones that are in the middle. This is also something that seems to be in keeping with Aristotle and many of the other philosophies that we encounter in this course.